look at the Trump trade agenda. Ashley Craig is chair of the International Trade and Logistics Group of Venable LLP. Hello, Ashley.
Rob, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for taking time with me. This is going to be a quick overview of some of the high points of what we might expect from the Trump administration on the trade front in the coming year. Let's start with tariffs and trade policy. That's been in the news all over the place. What are we seeing and what can we expect?
Well, Rob, the one thing that we can probably all agree on is this first week, and we're not even at day 7. The
Yeah.
president has followed through mostly on what he said on the campaign trail. So if you go back to the spring, when he really started to ratchet up his focus on tariffs, the rhetoric also was focused on tariffs. We now are seeing the president follow through. Don't have clarity just yet, although he has indicated that come February 1st, a 25% tariff will be imposed on anything and everything crossing the northern and southern border coming from origin of Canada and Mexico. He's also indicated a 10% additional amount of duties on China goods. Need some clarity and obviously some confirmation on all of that,
Mhm.
but eyes are on February 1. Also, we are thinking through the process by which he will impose such tariffs. He has a variety of different statutory authorities that he can invoke, as he did about 6.5 years ago, primarily under Section 301, as well as Section 201. We do think that in order to impose duties effective almost immediately, he's likely to take a play out of the Economic Powers Act, IEPA, which enables him to do so. Now, IEPA has traditionally been used to impose sanctions on overseas entities as well as countries. So think North Korea, Cuba, Iran. He did, back about 6.5 years ago, threaten to use IEPA against Mexico. He never did. And Mr. Trump forced that to the bargaining table, meaning he brought the Mexicans to talk about redoing NAFTA. So all indications seem to be reading the tea leaves. He's going to invoke IEPA on or around February 1st, and he's going to impose these 25% and the 10% China, Mexico, and Canada.
Mhm.
The basis is largely going to be, we believe, invoking the fentanyl epidemic, and he's going to tie that into a national security concern.
Mhm. He has apparently, though, held off for the time on his threat to impose tariffs on European imports.
That is correct.
Mhm.
We anticipate additional action on the tariff front outside of the three I just named, likely in Q1 or Q2 of this year. I think that the trade team within the executive office of the president is still getting their sea legs. We still don't have an official USTR, but Mr. Greer is likely going to be him. But I do think we'll see additional, at least proposals following February 1st.
All right. Another change that's been in the works for the last year or so, and probably will, take form in the Trump administration, is the so-called de minimis allowance, $800 per package per day for import shipments entering the U.S. in a duty and tax-free status. There's been a lot of talk about either lowering that allowance or eliminating it altogether. What might we expect to see?
Very good point, and something that is definitely linked to the fentanyl situation that I referenced earlier, Rob. If you go back about 10, 12 years ago, actually even deeper, there was a debate over increasing or decreasing de minimis. A lot of the express carriers supported lowering de minimis even below 800 because they foresaw the increase in B2C transactions,
Mhm.
various platforms that have become essentially mainstays for US consumers. During the pandemic, we saw an uptick in that B2C transaction and a corresponding increase in need to get that product once you've purchased it to your doorfront. Unfortunately, there's been an abuse of the de minimis 800, not only in terms of fentanyl and the illicit drug trade, but others that were trying to circumvent Section 301 tariffs. This has been documented by CBP, other agencies during the Biden administration. We did see the Biden team try to tighten up de minimis before it left town. And I do think we're going to see a continued focus from the new Trump team on how do we tighten or perhaps do we revisit increasing de minimis to where we were, again, 12,
Mhm.
14 plus years ago. So do
Yeah.
not keep your eyes off of de minimis. I think it's definitely something that this team is going to focus on.
And of course, the big target or the big problem there were the Chinese online or e-commerce sellers, Temu and Shein, who were
Correct.
making the most use of that privilege. What about economic sanctions and increased enforcement of, for instance, the Uyghur Protection Act in China against the anything coming from
Mhm.
Xinjiang province? Will the Trump administration pick up the ball that the Biden administration was already running with on that?
Two good points. Let's talk about economic sanctions first, and then I'll
Okay.
jump into forced labor. I think that this administration is going to look at all the tools that they have in their toolbox. So there has been some speculation that maybe there'll be some rollback with the Russian sanctions, although this week the president said that Mr. Putin was doing a very terrible job and helping to ruin Russia. We didn't see that one coming per
Hmm.
se.
Yeah.
Obviously, he has a fixation when it regards to North Korea, Iran, Cuba. So I don't anticipate there being a sea change in any way, shape, or form when it comes to rolling back any of our U.S. sanctions. Maybe slight modifications with regards to, as I said, Russia in certain sectors. I believe, once again, it will be an opportunity for this trade team to leverage non-traditional operations and vehicles in advance of the trade policy objectives of this team. So if anything, I think you're going to see increased enforcement with regards to sanctions, in particular as it applies to North Korea and Iran and Cuba.
Mhm.
But the dust hasn't even started to settle yet. With regards to forced labor, you mentioned the so-called Uyghur uh, Forced Labor Protection Act, or UFLPA. This act is a few years old. The Biden team is really the first to implement and enforce. CBP is the frontline enforcer of UFLPA. They have now gotten their hands around it. We did see an uptick in the amount of detentions and seizures in the last 12 to 24 months under UFLPA. Again, a tool in the toolbox when it comes to providing pressure points against, in particular, China. There is this misnomer that it's anything and everything coming from the Xinjiang region. That is true. There is a presumption that anything and everything coming from that region, be it whole or in part, was produced by forced labor, hence the application of the act. But it also attaches to forced labor outside of the region. And what we've seen the Chinese authorities do is to move the Uyghur population out of that province into other areas and then
Mhm.
continue to engage in forced labor. U.S. government under the Biden team has become aware of this. And again, we see a continuation of it. The one thing that I'm struggling with here, though, Rob, is you have CBP, which is stretched thin. Currently, the leadership is all Border Patrol, not legacy CBP.
Right.
I am curious as to how that's going to impact trade facilitation. In addition, we have the president focused on the immigration issue on the southern border. We have already seen in this first week deportations. We've seen the military deployed as well. So I am wondering how much you can stretch CBP on a variety of different fronts without the agency essentially becoming dysfunctional.
Mhm.
So a lot to see, a lot still to question, but I do anticipate increased enforcement under UFLPA by CBP and the Trump administration.
The Committee on Foreign Trade and Investment in the United States, also known as CFIUS. What is CFIUS and what role will it play in the new Trump administration?
So CFIUS is a multi-agency body that goes back several decades, and its primary focus is to review foreign transactions, i.e. foreign investment in the United States. The statute, the underlying statute, was amended a few years ago to help tighten up its authority and to cover certain transactions and make them mandatory. Traditionally, it was a voluntary submission, and you would do it because if you did have a foreign investment partner in a U.S. business, you wanted to get that blessing from the U.S. government so that the deal could not be undone, unwound years forward if there was a national security concern found. That is the primary focus, national security. So there are certain sectors, infrastructure is one, that come under the mandatory filing. I'm being a bit general, but that's it in a nutshell. The committee has become increasingly more and more important in terms of supply chain activity. You may remember about 15, 18 years ago now, DP World looked at acquiring certain terminal assets here in the United States, which were held by the old British outfit P&O Ports. There was an uproar that became
Mhm.
highly political, and DP World eventually pulled out of the U.S. market, never finished those transactions. Fast forwarding to today, I do see this again being a tool in the toolbox of the administration. Primarily, it has been focused on Chinese investment in the United States, and we have just seen a huge decrease in that activity. But we will have to wait and see what this team does. And we were talking before, and you mentioned how just yesterday in Davos, or at least virtually, the president called upon our friends in Saudi to come and invest heavily in U.S. infrastructure. That's an interesting call, if you will, by the president. It would be traditionally covered under CFIUS. The president ultimately is the one that can say yay or nay if there is a determination under the CFIUS review that a transaction is questionable from a national security perspective. So think about the Nippon Steel proposed acquisition of U.S. Steel.
Right.
President Biden ultimately said no to that, thumbs down. And I believe that the president that is currently in the Oval Office agrees with that position. But CFIUS will be an important area when it comes to trade policy. Again, a unorthodox approach to leveraging, if you will, atypical means at the disposal of the president to help advance trade policy outside of the traditional areas.
Bottom line, according to a recent Venable client alert, the world appears poised to move toward more rather than fewer global trade restrictions. You agree?
I do.
That's what we're in for, huh?
That is where we are right now.
Yeah.
Although the world remains flat, as Mr. Friedman said decades ago, it seems to be changing in many ways when it comes to supply chain operations and global commerce.
Ashley Craig of Venable, thank you so much for checking in with us on these big issues. So much to be said about. I hope we can continue this conversation going forward. But for now, thank you very much for being with me.
Thank you very much, Rob, as well. Look forward to it.